We do hope that during or after tonight's event, you'll consider joining the Free Speech Union. Hopefully you'll see tonight as a kind of showcase for what we do, and that from as little as £2.49 a month, you can receive invitations to events like these, which are normally just for members, and get discounted tickets to our in-person events. But you'll also be able to seek advice from our expert case team, as some of our speakers have tonight, whose expertise in navigating the contemporary free speech issues is really second to none. And as you can imagine, it's growing by the day, just by dealing with the kind of 50+ cases that come to us every week, inquiring about whether we can help them. So if you join us, you'll be part of a national and an international community of people who are trying to stand up to cancel culture in all its forms, and to really get ahead of the curve when it comes to the obstacles that free speech is facing at the moment. So on to tonight's speakers. So all of our speakers are either parents or campaigners who have become so concerned by what children are being taught in school that they have taken action, and we'll explore with them what it is that they've done and what it was that the problem that they think that is going on in the first place, what drew it to their attention. So first of all, we have Claire Page, who's a mother with children at London state schools, who became aware of highly politicised teaching about race and gender becoming a routine part of the school day. And I think she particularly became aware of that during lockdown, as many parents did, when teaching went online and they were able to see what kinds of teaching their children were receiving. And Claire is currently engaged in a legal challenge to allow parents greater access to the teaching materials that are used with their children. Then we have Caroline Fisk, who was a Conservative councillor for 8 years and who 2 years ago set up for Conservatives for Women to draw attention to what she sees as the unquestioning adoption and promotion of gender ideology with attendant harms, and particularly within schools, but also more broadly in society. And then finally, we have Adrian Hart, who way back in 2008 published a book called The Myth of Racist Kids, which is an excellent book that I would recommend and was going to wave around, but I've lent it to somebody, I think. Taking issue, that book took issue with the way in which the behaviour of even very young children was being monitored for signs of racial prejudice. And that was back in 2008. So he's got a long history of kind of tracking this issue through the education system. And then more recently, he challenged Brighton and Hove Council over the teacher training materials they were using on the subject of race. So he's an active supporter of Don't Divide Us, which many of you will have heard of, but he's not an official spokesman for them, but he's informs their work and they inform his campaigning. So over to Toby to take us through the discussion.
Welcome to Adrian and Caroline and Claire. Claire, I'm going to start with you. What was the critical issue when that you first became, which prompted you to become concerned about what your children are being taught in schools? When was that, and what have you done about it?
I think I got a bit of an early warning because my daughter's primary school was an early adopter of RSE, which is relationships and sex education, and there was a new guidance to come out in 2020, but actually some schools trialled it from about 2017 or 2018. So our primary school, in order to sort of meet what it felt was required of RSE, joined a scheme called Educate and Celebrate, and that was an LGBT plus inclusion scheme. And so for a while there was, there were a lot of rainbows about the school, and there was a lot of kind of new books, and it was about, supposedly, I think the term used was usualizing. And I don't think I thought very much of it, actually. And then my daughter came home and explained that she'd had a special lesson, and it had been discovered that there are many more than two genders. And then she also explained that she needed to start using the gender-neutral pronoun they in all historical contexts, because we can't be sure that historical figures, we can't be sure of what their preferred pronoun was because they're no longer here to tell us. So I felt, at this point, actually a line had been crossed, because these are non-factual ideas, they're opinions, and they were being presented as fact that had to be believed and used, actually. And so from a free speech point of view, it was a realization, not so much that her speech was being obstructed, but that it was being compelled. It had to be a certain kind of speech, and she had to use this gender neutral language. So I made what I thought would be a really simple complaint. I thought maybe this was a headmistress who had, just had a particular interest and was pushing something a little bit too far. But I was really stunned to find that the head teachers, the governors, all explained that actually, no, this scheme was ratified by the DFE. It was best practice according to Ofsted. Stonewall was also the DFE's consultant on this and had recommended all of the providers. And therefore, my complaint wouldn't stand, because actually this was what the government really meant to happen. So that's when I kind of realized there's quite a big edifice of people in agreement that the children's speech should be altered, and no real concern about the Education Act and the laws about indoctrination. So okay. Yeah, about 2017.
Before we get on to what you have tried to do about it and whether or not you've had any success, let's just for a second, let's come back to that collectively. But just before we turn to Adrian, why is that, in your view, a free speech issue? I mean, some people might argue that, well, aren't schools entitled to free speech? Don't teachers have free speech? If you're trying to prevent them from expressing their admittedly Stonewallian point of view, aren't you infringing on their free speech? Why should we care about it as pro-free speech people?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm pro-free speech up to the point of harm. So I'm not an absolutist on free speech, and I think any Democrat probably can't be. We have law, so we have free speech within the law, and then we have to have a big argument about where those limits are. And so I think nobody has absolute free speech. And in the case of teachers, they have an extra restriction that we have agreed in law, and that is in the Education Act, and it specifically says that teachers they are prohibited from expressing their own personal opinions with the intention of persuading and promoting it to a child. And it seems like a fairly obvious safeguard to put in place, because children are naive, and also they are there to learn facts and knowledge without question from these teachers. So teachers have this privileged position of imparting knowledge, and if they do that without to persuade a child, the child is in a vulnerable position. And that piece of law, I think, seems to be a good limitation on some free speech of teachers.
And I guess just finally, to push back again, some teachers might say, well, yes, of course, if we're introducing the children to politically contentious subject matter, then we are under an obligation to be impartial and balanced. But there's nothing politically contentious about this LGBTQ plus inclusive agenda. That seems to be something that's been agreed by all the main political parties. It's been agreed by the officials within the Department for Education. It's being promoted by international bodies like UNICEF. It's not politically contentious anymore. You're living in the dark ages. Of course, we would observe the law when it came to anything remotely politically controversial, but this is just completely mainstream now. It would be, we don't have to be balanced when teaching children that racism is wrong. So why should we have to be balanced in teaching them that transphobia is wrong?
Yes, I mean, I think that there is a difference between teaching a child that a prejudice or discrimination is wrong. And I think possibly we have a kind of universal understanding of that. I think what's different is that there's actually teaching children what to believe, and that they must espouse that. And that's starting to actually cross the line to alter their free speech. So we brought the free speech of the child and the teacher into conflict by bringing the political subject into the classroom. And, I think, yes, it is first of all, the government has just released an impartiality guidance, which has actually given a better understanding of what is a politically contentious issue. And I think that's really welcome, because that argument that you made, which is, look, this is now mainstream. Mainstream isn't good enough. Mainstream can still be disagreed with quite passionately, and the impartiality guidance does lay out quite carefully that that things which are reasonably contentious, even if both political parties agree, but are argued in the press, are argued between large numbers of people, this is a political issue, and you've got to be impartial on that.
Okay, thanks. Adrian, shall we bring you in? You have done some campaigning for Don't Divide Us, although you're not a Don't Divide Us spokesperson. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Don't Divide Us, when it was set up, what it's, how it's bringing teachers together, and how do you think about, how do you navigate that difficult question of what is politically contentious and what is just something that all children should be taught, and just part of the core values of our modern multicultural society?
Okay, well, I joined Don't Divide Us a few weeks in from its start out somewhere in the autumn of 2020. And of course, we'd all been reeling, especially here in Brighton, it felt to me, that over events that were taking place and in the wake of BLM, and the extraordinary fervor of the council here to be seen to be implementing an active form of so-called anti-racism based on a set of new ideas. It presented in some ways as though nothing much had changed, but this was a more proactive version of anti-racism, and they smuggled it in. And we, thanks to Don't Divide Us and the work it started doing in discussing these matters, looking at critical race theory, making it possible for parents and teachers to make contact with them, because people were starting to be got at and nobbled in work and in colleges and universities and places like that. Don't Divide Us supporters in Brighton started to kind of drill into what was going on. And in many ways, unlike Claire and Caroline, I mean, I'm here because of not so much an insight into what is being taught in schools. I have some insight into that, but our problem is that they won't let us know about it or see it. What I'm aware of is that even if we could see some of the things going on in schools, we ain't seeing nothing yet, because the Brighton and Hove Council plan for schools is only really just landing. And it is a strategy that has implemented through the back door a critical race theory program. So, I mean, I could give some examples of what troubled Don't Divide Us supporters so much. I think it's really that we read the strategy when it was published in November 2020. We could see that it was talking about teacher training called Racial Literacy 101, but they would not show it to us, and they would not show it to any parents or even any counselors. But in reading the strategy, we could see that it had CRT footprints all over it. You know, from—
Just explain what CRT is for those who—
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, CRT puts race, as in skin color, at the very center of social relations in white dominated societies. You know, class might intersect as a factor, but its significance is relegated. And so CRT starts with its conclusions, I think, by presenting controversial and contested concepts such as white privilege, unconscious bias, and systemic racism as though they are a matter of fact. And, you know, I could say so much about that, but it's probably better to just say how Brighton and Hove described it, because this is how they kind of sugarcoat what they slide through committees in order to get them approved. Brighton simply said that racism is an entrenched problem in British society at large and in our school systems, because that's a bold statement, and it has a little bit of a CRT kind of warning on it. Racism is understood as structural, systemic, and institutional, they said. So we thought, well, maybe they've just been reading that off BLM placards from the summer. We didn't know. And then they said educators of color that they would select must be involved at every level of decision making in anti-racist work, which you could think was fine. And then we realized they just selected people that agree with them. And then they said the curriculum will need to be diversified and decolonized. And of course, when we did get a leaked copy of the teacher training, you know, one of the slides, the infamous slide 36, the pyramid, well, we call it the kind of white supremacy pyramid. I think they call it that too, intended to illustrate the operation of overt and covert white supremacy. I mean, the triangle shows lynching at the top, and supposedly created and reinforced by things like denial of white privilege, colorblindness, if you please. The pyramid is intended to demonstrate a spurious causal relationship between philosophical belief and the principle of colorblindness. And so that's when it hit home. When we saw that leaked copy, that was just one of 80 slides, I might add. But that one stood out because it was being shown as a teacher training component to really illustrate how teachers needed to get in with the new enlightened thinking, which was to presume that our city and our schools are dripping in racism.
And was this training that Brighton and Hove Council was proposing to roll out across all their schools? Is that what you mean by teacher training? Yes.
So schools aren't obliged to take the training recommended by councils, but and I think DDU have found this in other local authorities, is that they very often just do, because the schools are kind of reminding them of their obligations under the Equalities Act, which is a bit rich, because when you look at the public sector equalities duty on fostering good relations, you start to think, well, I'm not quite convinced that this is going to do that. But in any case, schools, and I'm a huge defender of schools and of teachers, and I always have been. And they, you know, busy, hardworking schools just thought, yes, we'll take that. It was all paid for and commissioned by the council. So, but in answering your question fully, I would have to kind of highlight the role of third-party providers, because for me, that is by far and away the most troubling element in all of this, and probably is for Claire and Caroline too in their areas, because what you have there is groups, unregulated groups that activists. I mean, Frank, I don't want to be sound pejorative about activists, by the way, but you know, they are groups of activists that invent themselves as little companies or outfits and offer their services to well, in Brighton it was to their friends in the council, and onward that they go. In Brighton it was just a single third-party provider that actually wrote the strategy as well as designed and delivered the teacher training.
Okay, Caroline, you're also concerned, like Adrian and Claire as well, I imagine, about transparency and schools being unwilling to openly share with parents what it is, what resources are being used in the school to teach their children about things like racism and how many different genders there are. Do you want to talk about your own experiences of being stonewalled by schools, or talking to parents who've been stonewalled by schools, and what efforts you've made to try and get schools to be a little more open about what's being taught in the classroom, so parents can actually see what's going on?
And first of all, I would, if you don't mind, I'll just go back when you challenged Claire about in what sense is this a free speech issue? You know, what's wrong with, you know, people coming up with a new idea about gender identity and, you know, teaching and discussing this in the classroom. But what I think we all need to understand is that gender ideology is on such rocky, unscientific, ahistorical foundations that the challenge to free speech is baked right into the core of gender ideology. So if you open your mouth to start talking about gender ideology, the very minute somebody asks a question and challenges it, that's transphobic. So the challenge to free speech is baked into the very heart of gender ideology, and that manifests itself in how it's taught in the schools. So the schools, almost as soon as they open out about gender ideology, will also teach that it is transphobic bullying to challenge the narrative. And I can show some documents on that, which I would love to share with people. So just on the question that you asked me, exactly sort of the manifestation of that is that when parents have sought to understand or to ask to see the resources that schools are using, generally the third-party providers will have sort of some clause to say that these can't be shared with parents, can't be shown to parents. And so parents have done freedom of information requests to schools to ask to see the resources, and schools advised by the providers have said that they're commercially confidential, and that's why the parents can't see them.
That precise tactic of explaining that the materials were under commercial secrecy and therefore I couldn't see the lesson plans being taught to my daughter, that tactic was used by our secondary school. Actually, it wasn't the school, it was the third-party provider really put that idea across that their material was secret and commercial. And I've therefore made a freedom of information request that was denied, and then went on to the ICO, which is the Information Commissioner's Office, who I'm hoping will adjudicate that the public interest to see what children or school outweighs the commercial interest of any other provider. And if that comes the right way, that will set a really good precedent for the government, who doesn't seem to be moving very fast on this, and set a precedent. But it could go the wrong way. So
one thing I'm curious about, Claire, is that, I mean, it's never clear to me whether teachers, when they're teaching about something like systemic racism in the UK, or the different number of genders there are, and how, the gender binary is now out of date and scientifically it's been proven to be false and all the rest of it. Are they conscious that they are saying something politically contentious and promoting a kind of activist social justice agenda? Or are they just in a kind of echo chamber in which these are such mainstream, widely accepted ideas that they just think of them as commonsensical, as almost factual and not remotely contentious? Do you get a sense when talking to teachers and talking to head teachers and complaining unsuccessfully to governing bodies, that they don't think of themselves as pursuing an activist agenda? They're not trying to promote a kind of progressive point of view. They just see this as just kind of almost anodyinely mainstream, and they think of you as a bit of a nut for kind of kicking up any sort of fuss about it.
Yes, I certainly have been seen as a nut. I've also been described as a harasser, and I've been told my background is not correct in order to make these claims. I think I see a deal of just going with the tide, just going with the flow. It's what everyone else believes and thinks. And the reason it's so contagious in that way is because these ideas come with the idea that you're holding the moral high ground when you espouse these ideas, and everybody wants to be moral and good. They want to be on the right side of this, and yes, there is a sector-wide sort of almost belief structure, I think, going on about that, and a lot of people just don't see anything wrong with just promoting the latest positive progressive thinking. There are, however, I think some people who are extremely concerted and dedicated to forwarding a political message with this, and they construct it very knowingly, very carefully. They put all sorts of legal defenses, and you can just tell by the way that you're being treated and talked to about this that this person is not in good faith. When someone describes you as an anti-LGBT harasser when you haven't harassed, we know now that somebody's got they've got something they want to achieve against you, and that's a very different level. And I'd say in the third sector providers, there is far more concerted, meaningful political strategy going on, and mostly amongst teachers, it's fashion. It's just going with the flow.
These ideas, I would say, these ideas are not mainstream amongst the British public. They are certainly in vogue in the kind of, sealed circles of public sector councils and a lot of teachers. But even then, when I do speak to a few teachers, and a lot of them just, they're with the British public. They just have to keep their head down. And this is the thing that you can't underestimate, the fear of challenging this stuff. Certainly anti-racism. It's, if something has been labeled anti-racism and you're standing up to criticize it, and you haven't really had time between marking essays for 6 hours at the weekend to really research, you're going to just opt to just keep your mouth shut. So, I mean, here's the first free speech issue, I think. Of course, we're free to believe, as the council in Brighton does, that British society is hardwired with systemic racism and white privilege, that the racially illiterate minds of the masses are, shot through with unconscious bias and so on. But to promote this belief in schools as fact is an argument for indoctrination. And I think we should be clear about that. As such, it actively restricts the ability of pupils to debate the issues of race and racism freely, because they're ultimately compelled towards certain beliefs designated by their teachers as learning objectives. Now, in their world, they don't think that they're out there kind of activists kind of with some radical thing. They think it's just learning objectives, especially if councils are acting as introductory agencies for the consultants that come in and say, oh yes, no, this is the enlightened view of anti-racism. And here's another free speech issue, by the way. I'll just pop in. Defenders of critical race theory in schools like to attack critics as though it's us who want to restrict free speech by banning CRT altogether. And this tends to come from academics, especially at the Institute of Education, I've noticed, who confuse academia with school. They fundamentally confuse those two things because they're academics and they don't, I don't know. They forget that the knowledge taught in school has to be the most reliable, not that considered the most politically radical by academics.
I mean, it seems as though, I think we probably all agree that politically contentious things are being taught to children in schools in a very one-sided way. And they generally reflect a kind of woke social justice worldview. And it may well be that in some cases they are breaching their legal duty under the Education Act 1996, and even and in spite of the DfE issuing some fairly mild guidance to schools late last year. Things don't seem to be improving, they just seem to be getting worse. So what can we do about it? Well, one avenue, there does seem to be a real disconnect, I think, between the views of parents and what's being taught to their children in school. And in America, that's become a kind of political hot button issue. And we've seen various sensational election results, and we're likely to see more, where parents have organized and got elected to positions on school boards and stopped the teaching of things like critical race theory as fact in their children's schools. Is there something it's not so obvious how we can politically organize over here to try and bring a bit of balance and common sense back into schools? You made an effort, I think, with some others to try and persuade the government to amend the education bill currently wending its way through Parliament to force schools to be a little bit more forthcoming when parents ask what their children are being taught in the classroom, but without much success. And Liz Truss didn't appoint Kemi Badenoch as the Secretary of State for Education, but Kit Malthouse, who seems to be someone less likely to kind of disrupt the apple cart than Kemi Badenoch. So I'm not sure that we're going to get much political support within the current Conservative government, though let's not rule it out. What else can we do? Can we become school governors? should someone like Adrian run for election in Brighton and Hove and try and, become the councillor who oversees children's schools and families, or whatever it's called?
I am running.
Oh, great. Okay, good. But anyway, Caroline, any ideas about what we can do to push back against some of this?
Well, I want to sort of, say that it's going to be extremely hard. We've had consistent messaging from I just want to just show one of the resources I was going to show before. It's actually from the Crown Prosecution Service, no less. And it's co-written by the National Council of Police Chiefs. So this was a document for schools from, the UK's prosecuting authorities and from the police to say that, teaching gender ideology, but making very clear that challenging gender ideology and gender identity will be regarded as a hate incident, and that the police are interested and the police will be concerned. So that's a very direct message, a document to children, to 11-year-olds through to 16-year-olds, their teachers and school staff, to say, you better be careful, giving the definition of hate incidents and saying any incident which is perceived to be homophobic or transphobic by the victim or any other person is a hate incident. So that's just not something out in wider society. That's something that the Crown Prosecution Service and police chiefs prepared for schools. Now that's been withdrawn, but for over a year that sat. So when you've had that influence in schools, and the Government Equalities Office also paid for resources. This is another one, £3 million of taxpayers' money. The Government Equality Office gave out that money for these resources to be produced. And they told children and teachers that it was transphobic bullying to question the narrative. So when you've had years of this, it's going to be very, very hard to turn the tide. And I think, one teacher is concerned, they get called transphobic. One parent is concerned, they get called transphobic. So I think we need to be aware that it's going to be very, very hard. And we need to continue to engage the government. We need new relationship and sex education guidance. We need new teaching at teaching training colleges, and we need a new approach from Ofsted. But nevertheless, coming back to your question, I think, parents have to inform other parents. Parents have to challenge teachers. I think it would be amazing for people to stand to be governors and to be counsellors. I was speaking to another parent today, and the stuff that's going into their schools is coming from the council. And she's challenged the council, but it's a Lib Dem council or a Labour council. And these councils are saying, look, we're just going to steamroller ahead. So that parent is just pushed back. Nevertheless, what choice do we have but to keep going? We also need brave individuals to step forward with court cases.
Yeah, so the reason the CPS guidance you just referred to has been withdrawn was due to a successful case brought by the solicitor Paul Conraith, I think on behalf of a child who had had a hate incident recorded against their name because they, misgendered a trans child or something along those lines. So yeah, there are some legal remedies, but that is a cumbersome and expensive way to fight back. Claire, you've been quite energetic about complaining about some of the things your daughter in particular has been taught in schools. Have you made any headway there, or has it just been, have you just got stuck in a labyrinth? I've
made some headway. So optimistically, you can make some differences. And actually, the headmistress of our school has changed. I don't know if that's to do with me, but it seemed to kind of be slightly concurrent. The school has retracted some things. I had a very big, what I consider a win, which is that the school has agreed never to work with the third-party provider that provided some sex education for the kids. And they've agreed never to work with them again after I managed to show them how they were indoctrinating and also producing really inappropriate material just to the side of what they did in the school, but on their own websites, things that were not age appropriate. And so I've had some successes, and the school has responded positively on a few occasions. Most of the while it's fought very hard, and I got no help from the Education Skills Funding Agency or from the DFE. I think I would say that the reason that these complaints don't work very well is fundamentally because most or a leading part of this indoctrination is coming from the government itself. It's coming from very poorly thought out government guidance from the DFE, which actually provides schools with all sorts of excuses. So although there's some nice, clear law in the Education Act, it's been kind of covered up with multiple commands of how the schools must be inclusive in what, and also to take positive action. So that's a word that appears in a couple of places in school guidance. You need to take positive action to be seen to be, if you like, equalising people with regard to minority, majority identity status. And if you command somebody to take positive action, it's very hard for that not to turn out political one way or the other. So I think we could be asking the government to remove some of these commands from the DFE. And certainly that's something I would like to campaign for, is to improve that guidance.
And Adrian, before we come to the Q&A, which I think we'll come to in a minute, just tell us about running for as a councillor in a ward in Brighton and Hove. Do you stand any chance?
No, I don't stand any chance at all. But I could say more about that, but I actually, would you mind if I just kind of like go back to the thing about parents, organising parents?
Sure.
And no doubt I'll use my platform to talk about that a lot. So, you know, there's a purpose for running. I'm running as an independent, by the way. It's only parents who can fight this. At the moment, though, the power they have is largely untapped. You know, the strategy is horrible right now, the way it warns off some staff and parents, including Black parents, who are, and I quote, reluctant to acknowledge the strategy, keen to sabotage it. And so parents I've met have been cold-shouldered, but it's because there's not enough of them yet. It was particularly horrible that the strategy says potentially schools may need to offer racial literacy programs, not just for their children, but for them. No, I wanted to say just like something about the legal stuff. I just think that we have to be careful, you know, if the demands are too shrill for legal remedy, it risks inflaming a culture warfare, which I'm sensitive and open to what people say about what can be done on that front, but it just I'm worried about it. It just feels like it ends so easily with an unedifying exchange of name calling over who is the racist, who is the authoritarian or the anti-democrat or anti-free speech. You know, what we want is for advocates of CRT and these policies to argue honestly and out in the open. You know, there is a law, it's the Education Act. You know, maybe we can take a fresh run at section 406 and 407, and advocates of this stuff must explain why their ideas comply with it. So, you know, that plus the returning to the thing about how we can't underestimate the fear that goes with this at the moment on the racism stuff, not so much the gender ideology stuff, but just how it acts as a kind of paralyzing kind of force field, you know, and it certainly did that at the council. If anyone thinks Brighton is just a wacky town where this stuff happens, they need to be aware that it could happen anywhere. It really could, you know, to watch so many conservative councillors just look terrified and say nothing and approve it. I mean, with one or two brave exceptions latterly, I might say, and also amongst Labour, but it was a bit late by then.
Just before we go to the Q&A, I just want to throw one idea out there, which is that I've been talking to some concerned parents about the possibility of setting up a kind of national union of parents, which would be an organization a bit like the FSU, but would agitate and campaign on behalf of its parent members. But I discovered recently that there actually used to be something called the Parents' National Education Union. It was started in the 1880s and didn't shut down, I think, until 1943. So it might just be possible to revive that organization. I'm thinking of it as a sort of paramilitary wing of Mumsnet. And Mumsnet has been sort of reasonably helpful on some of these issues. It seems to have become red-pilled by kind of gender ideology and recognizes that, you know, their children are being taught things in school which are completely at odds with their, you know, feminist values. Anyway, should we throw it open to the wider public now, Jan? Adrian, what can teachers do when they're asked to chant smash heteronormativity, knowing that if they don't go along with it, they could have their card marked?
They're absolutely stuffed because there's something called the NEU, but I really would say that they need to join the Free Speech Union and support anything that you set up that is perhaps more focused on the dilemma of teachers, as you mentioned about parents. But no, I just think that I just think it's about numbers. You know, the essential idea of the parent fight back is that we just need people to feel not exposed because there's more. When there is many, you are stronger. And the sort of fundamental notion of a union, whether it's the FSU or the way that teaching unions might once have been, that speaks to that. I think we just need campaigns, old-fashioned campaigns. It sounds very, very kind of leftist of me, but then I kind of am from those roots, and so it's natural to me to just think let's just start building.
And just to be clear about what you said at the beginning, Adrian, if a teacher was penalized for refusing to chant smash heteronormativity in their school, and they were a member of the National Education Union, and they reached out to their union rep for help, you think they'd get none?
Well, you know, there are people that have come to DDU who are former members and activists in the NEU from the old days, and they would have a lot to say about that. I don't know enough to answer that question, to be honest. But the NEU is the kind of is really the epicenter of so much of this idea. I mean, it really takes all this woke stuff and just regurgitates it, and that creates a kind of stifling atmosphere for its members. No, you know, nobody can stand up to it. It's just run by a few people, and its membership just kind of, and it's almost like a sort of the same kind of format that takes place in councils or anywhere else. It's the fear of challenging it, but it's a numbers game.
The funny thing about copyright is copyright protects you from copying, what I mean is it protects somebody from using the material that's being provided. So there is actually no excuse for commercial secrecy. It's simply there to stop the parents taught. If you think about it, a textbook is published and it has copyright. So I cannot reprint that and use it to make money myself. So copyright is actually doing the job that they're pretending needs to be done by this secrecy. So if you want, with a freedom of information request,
I would say that, you know, that this person's feeling isolated. I think a governor can absolutely probe the content of the curriculum, particularly if there's a risk that it's in contravention of the Education Act, sorry. So I think they can ask to look at RSC materials and they can point out a risk. And, you know, they can go armed with the government's new guidance about political neutrality and Suella Braverman's speech. And so, no, I would say that governor probably needs to try and find allies. I think the key issue for me is exactly what Adrian said. anyone is fearful of acting alone. So I would say to all parents, to all teachers, lay your groundwork, find some allies, and then make sure there's 2 or 3 of you. And then I would say now we've got the resources from Suella Braverman, from the new guidance on political neutrality. Take this material in. And I really think now you have an effective challenge, but you need allies first.
Do you think that a safeguarding governor who thinks that safeguarding issues are raised by the manner in which gender ideology is being taught in the classroom could make any headway raising safeguarding concerns? I mean, yeah, they could say, look, an above average number of children in our school have come out as non-binary or trans as a result of this particular program being taught by, this external agency during RSE classes. Could you raise that as a safeguarding concern, and would you get anywhere if you did?
Yeah, you absolutely should raise it as a safeguarding concern, that you have a duty of care to the children. And this is potentially, like, for example, affirming a child or promoting gender ideology to children, misleading them about how safe it is, when in fact it's incredibly risky to go down the route of, puberty blockers. So I absolutely think that parents, teachers, governors should raise the safeguarding issue and your breach of your duty of care. Whether they get anywhere with it is a different issue, again, because of the scale of the indoctrination. But, it'll make teachers, head teachers, think twice. And maybe that's the thing which will say, right, they'll say, we've been rumbled, we've got to stop now.
Claire, yeah, do you want to come in on that? I mean, I'm thinking in particular, I'm always slightly wary of encouraging children who want to question and challenge the kind of prevailing orthodoxy in the classroom of doing so, because I'm worried that if they do that, it's not that they'll get detentions, but that they'll be ostracized by their peers. They'll be labeled kind of Tory scum or homophobes or transphobes or racists or whatever it is, and attacked on social media and be bullied. Do you think there's much appetite in your daughter's schools, for instance, to discuss issues like whether girls who identify as boys should be able to, or whether boys who identify as girls should be able to change in the girls' changing room and that kind of thing, or is there not much appetite? Do they just think there is just one acceptable view on this, and anyone who doesn't have it should be pushed out of our community? My
daughter's secondary school, there was a huge social media pressure amongst the children who were texting. And this is specifically amongst my daughter's in the 17% white minority. And I would say it was very much that minority which reinforced white privilege ideas, gender ideology. And I would say 7 out of 16 children in one class, a friend group of my daughter, were identifying as non-binary, and really either encouraging or enforcing each other in gender pronoun use, and sometimes not in a friendly and very exclusive way. So the children are certainly part of the problem, but then we need to understand that having been presented with this information, and this is, that comes, it's the adult's role to do something about that and to mind that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we prohibit from indoctrinating children. It's not just because it's not fair to them. It's also because they take on ideas very passionately. And we've seen that in the Maoist movements. Children will be the most passionate advocates of something because they don't have a full perspective yet. And so it's doubly wrong to indoctrinate them. And then just one more thing in response to what the question was. I think we don't actually have that much of a free speech crisis in this country. I think we have a crisis about what harm is. Liberal democracy is designed around the idea that we may be completely at liberty in speech and action so long as we don't harm others. And we used to have a sense of what that harm was, and we've decided culturally to change that from something quite material, theft, injury, to something that's psychological. And that new concept of psychological harm now needs to limit everyone else's actions of speech. And that's where we're coming into this big conflict. So I really agree with the questions.
I think we're going to wrap it up now, but can I just go back to the three of you to just give me like one recommendation? If parents who are concerned about this, particularly if their own children are being taught stuff in the classroom that is obviously politically contentious, but is being presented as just fact, what can they do? Claire, let's start with you. Just briefly, what's the top thing you'd recommend?
If you fancy a fight, make a formal complaint. If you don't fancy a fight, I think write to the Secretary of State. It's time for as many letters to reach the Secretary of State for Education.
Okay, thank you. Caroline.
Okay, I would say start speaking to other parents and find an ally. And then arm yourself with Suella Braverman's recent speech, the Cass report, the requirements for political neutrality, and then together with another parent or two, take these key documents into the school and ask them to read them and then to follow up afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. And Adrian.
Well, to all FSU members and others that have joined this evening, I would say join the brilliant Don't Divide Us campaign, and it's free. And I would say to parents, mandate schools. This is Don't Divide Us recommendation actually in the on the last page of their report, which came out very recently, which is a survey of all the local authorities of England and Wales, and the summary of the findings is quite kind of extraordinary, and third-party providers come up a lot in it. So they say mandate schools to list all third-party providers commissioned or invited into classes on their websites, and I think if that alone would be really helpful. And the other one, I suppose, would be to just kind of just got to really say it loud that education as a liberal endeavor is, it needs to be more strongly articulated in policy.
Thank you very much, Claire Page, Caroline Fisk, and Adrian Hart. Very kind of you to give up your time this evening. And thanks to all of you that listened and participated in the discussion. A very interesting discussion, and I'm sure one will come back to again and again.
Just a couple of things that came up in the chat and in the Q&A. There's loads and loads of questions and points in there. So the main thing was, from me, would say join the Free Speech Union. I do. The link is in the chat multiple times. So if you just go to our website and check out what we do, and there's a lot of different ways in which you can get involved and do things with us, and the things that we can do for you. So I would say join it. That includes regional speakeasies that we do. We have our live events in person and online, and there's also resources on our website that people can access as well. It does look like people are asking for resources. They are very hungry for resources they can take to head teachers, that they can spread amongst parents, that are kind of and use with children as well, that are kind of alternative sources of information, and then also just practical advice about how to take the steps to do the kinds of suggestions, that take those forwards that other people have made. So that might be something we could do.
So DDU has that as well, Jen, just to say.
Yes, I think the links have been going in the chat through
Great.
the evening, Adrian. And then finally, it also looks as though Scotland and Wales, there's people from Scotland and Wales and England in the chat, and then the Q&A, and it looks like things are getting moving. There's clearly a big appetite amongst parents and governors to do something here, so, and teachers indeed. So it looks as though this isn't the end of the discussion by any means. The recording will go up on YouTube. We'll let everybody know that that's going up. And thank you all for coming. Do join, and you can come to our future events, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks very much.